Why? Why, in a city so full of pain in its history, should anyone care about beauty? It's fascinating, isn't it? Why do we care about beauty?
This is London today. It's an international city whose remarkable history spans over 2,000 years of monarchy, civics, and conflict. In a city with such a rich past, there is one element that has always remained a priority in London society: architecture. London's architectural style is incredibly diverse. It reflects both the priorities and sense of beauty of each era in history, both prominent qualities in the lasting historic buildings. Buildings hundreds of years old now stand next to those of glass and steel that have shot up in the past year. Perhaps what makes London so unique is this unavoidable contrast of new and old.
The architectural style that is emerging in London now, which is most dominant, is what I would call a neoliberal style of architecture, which is basically big, often glass, sometimes brick, sometimes other cladding systems, but big apartment and office buildings which have radically altered the London skyline over the last 10 or 15 years.
But London hasn't always looked this way. As long as mankind has existed, architecture has held a fundamental role in tracking both human development and shifting cultures. As society's needs and values change, so do the buildings they inhabit. London has one of the richest and most complex architectural histories in the world, with a history dating all the way back to the Roman Empire.
You're asking about the impact of the Romans. Well, it was quite big because the Romans founded London.
I think what the Romans bequeathed wasn't really a style. It was the location of London, which they found the best river crossing. That's where they found the city. And the layout, to some extent, some of the, straight lines through the city and so on.
The most elite Roman structures were built with stone, but the average Roman building was constructed using timber frames and plaster. The layout of London, which the Romans established, remained pretty constant throughout history. So rather than expanding their city, London was built upon the foundations of the Romans and therefore upon their history. Throughout the Middle Ages, buildings were mainly constructed out of wood. However, this proved to be a poor choice when a huge fire struck near the River Thames.
When the Fire of London struck in 1666, it destroyed great swathes of the city of London. At that time, the city was built very close.
436 acres of London, which in 1666 was about 50% of the city, was decimated in the fire. It burned for 4 days straight, taking with it over 13,000 homes and 87 churches, one of which was St. Paul's. The Fire of London sparked a great reconstruction and a moment when the city came together to reimagine what London should look like. Many properties were rebuilt in place of what the fire destroyed, while others, like the reconstruction of St. Paul's, were erected in respect to the history and significance of Christianity in London. In the same way that much of London's original foundation is shaped by the Romans, the reconstruction that took place after the fire was shaped by its churches.
Christopher Wren had already been suggesting that things should be done to the cathedral, so he was ready. He was first in line when they said, who's going to fix this place?
And then after the fire, it was rebuilt in the same spot, but it was very much the focal point of the whole replanning. So the layout of the city is partly determined by its religious structures.
The building of all of those sort of famous London churches of that period that were overseen by people like Christopher Wren, Nicholas Hawksmoor and John Vanbrugh, and all of these buildings that are seen as quintessentially London buildings now. So very, very direct change in the kind of architecture as a result of the Fire of London.
The dominant style of construction post-Fire of London was called Georgian architecture, often made from brick and known for its symmetric build and window detail. After the Blitz in World War II, a massive amount of buildings were destroyed yet again, leading to a period of reconstruction until the 1980s, referred to as modernism, a brutalist and concrete style. In reality, London's current style of architecture is called postmodernism, but the term modern architecture is used commonly by citizens in reference to the towering glass and steel structures emerging in the past 10 to 20 years. But buildings like these didn't just appear out of nowhere. In 2004, former Mayor Ken Livingstone created a new tall building strategy, which included a revised height policy that gave financiers permission to build these megastructures.
He introduced the change in the building height policy, and then he was succeeded by Boris Johnson as Mayor of London, who's now our Prime Minister, of course. But when he came as Mayor of London, he said he was going to scrap the tall buildings policy. And then actually when he got into power, he didn't.
Over the past 30 years, buildings have shot up in London's skyline, completely altering its look. These skyscrapers have brought controversy, as some believe they detract from the historical conservation that London is known for.
We've had some quite controversial buildings. I don't know if you know of the walkie-talkie building, which some people think is interesting. I think it's absolutely abysmal. So yes, the walkie-talkie was one of the more controversial buildings. It's done by an American architect called Raphael Vignoli. He's also been building very tall, thin things in skyscrapers in New York. And it became, well, it's notorious anyway because it's a very peculiar shape. The premise of which was that the higher the floor, the more rent you would get for it. So they made it this shape so the top floors would be bigger. And it had an unfortunate effect in that it created a curved glass facade which, when the sun shone on it, it deflected like a magnifying glass the sun rays, and it famously melted somebody's Mercedes-Benz car that was parked in an area beneath it. So after that it got a new nickname, which was the walkie-scorchy.
Some people believe that these modern structures will never live up to London's classical composition.
What I don't like is too much glass. When you can see through glass buildings into people's desks, I don't like that. That doesn't look clean enough.
I feel like they don't make buildings like they used to.
No design quality really there. Quite boring, quite bland. Probably very much for the insurance industry.
When you look really closely, there's such intricate details that, I don't think people really do anymore.
I think the quality needs to be addressed to make sure they are unique and that they represent London as an up-and-coming city.
While others welcome the modern change.
To be fair, from where I live, I can see all the new buildings being built, so I feel like it's more and more of them. But I like it.
When it's modern, you can relate to it more than if it's historical. Then it's like old stuff.
The olden stuff, it doesn't appeal to me as much. I kind of feel like I wouldn't enjoy living in stuff like near stuff like that. But like in the more modern stuff, I feel like more like happy, if that makes sense in a way.
So on the one hand, we have this very extreme building of these, very, very modern looking, I guess, glass towers and so on. But on the other hand, we have a very strong conservation lobby, which means in some respects, particularly if you're doing things at a smaller scale, it's very difficult to build anything that isn't this kind of yellow brick that London is famous for. It's called a London stock brick.
London is known for conserving older buildings and building upon its history rather than replacing them. Over the years, this has created a unique and eye-catching contrast between building styles, as structures from different architectural periods stand boldly next to each other within the city.
But I think that's why when you've got cities like London that's got the really old buildings and then the really obviously, unique modern architecture, I think it's pretty cool.
I think the beauty of London is that it has both a mixture of really pretty old buildings and just very new and very clean, like shardy buildings.
Everything teaches us something. Even if it doesn't look the best, it teaches us something, and I think that's good enough.
And people are very fixated on appearance of buildings, but they're really generated by particular forms of economic history.
But these historic megaprojects, cathedrals, and even modern skyscrapers didn't just appear out of nowhere. St. Paul's Cathedral cost £1,095,556 in total construction fees, £167 million in today's terms, and was funded through an increased tax on coal. There are many projects like these. Large church-affiliated projects which monarchs publicly funded and relied tremendously on the heavy taxation of everyday civilians. Buildings being constructed today share a similar story. While the funding of modern buildings is difficult to track, the Shard, 20 Fenchurch Street, and the Leadenhall Building are examples, costing $1.2 billion, $200 million, and $1.15 billion to construct respectively. Their impact on local economies still reflects the civilian taxation of cathedrals from several centuries back, as these skyscrapers impose a similar economic burden on citizens today.
It has a very negative effect on the city because it pushes property prices up and up and up, which means they're not. It's out of the reach of the people who actually live here, or a lot of the people who actually live here.
I would say that trying to find cheap accommodation in London is really difficult. A lot of people end up living in older buildings that are like kind of run down because they're just cheaper. And a lot of the new buildings that they put up are like either further out or far away from especially for university students.
Sometimes these kinds of large developments happen in what used to be social housing estates, where local councils within London have sold these estates to developers under the auspices of regeneration. But in actual fact, it's a form of social cleansing, because there are a lot of social housing estates quite central in London which have become very valuable pieces of real estate. And developers are very keen to get their hands on them. So one of the reasons these buildings are so tall is because the land they sit on is so valuable.
Something like the Shard was sited near residential areas, so it's casting a big shadow over tiny little two-storey Victorian houses, which are the main, housing type around there. So the contrast between that and an enormous tower and the impact that has on people living underneath it. And that's happening more and more because they're spreading out from the centre. And one thing that's really unpopular, especially in residential developments, is they're bought up by people, say in Singapore or Barbados, or it could be anywhere, and they don't live in them. They're just bought up and they sit there empty as a way of making money.
We have huge housing problems here, and these kinds of buildings are really being built aimed at foreign investors or investors who are buying property in order to have a safe haven for their money, and they're not being built for the people who need them in a city like London, which is ordinary people like you and me who need somewhere to live.
These glass megastructures are not only being criticized due to their role in displacing citizens, but in the extreme wealth they represent. The relationship between economics and architecture is not one exclusively involving money, but is one largely dictated by power. Many of the projects, both past and present, are inextricably linked to the desire of monarchs, governments, or individuals to display their unbeatable power.
Power has been challenging beauty as well. And the answer is yes, there's always been a challenge with beauty versus power, because there have always been challenges of, frankly, if you're going to build a building, it's going to cost money. And there will be people who say, we want something else built here, and you want to build a church, isn't there one around the corner already? And there have been church buildings built with really bad motives.
Modern architecture, particularly today, projects power, and I think the most obvious way it does that is its phallocentrism. It's wanting to be the biggest and the tallest. Obviously, if you look at the skyline of the City of London, you're seeing this is big finance, this is big international capital being traded and moved around and so on. But it also projects its power in a very practical way, in that it's the financial clout of the people who are building these buildings that allows them to build them.
These skyscrapers represent an amount of wealth and power that is unattainable to the vast majority of Londoners who have to see these structures every day. While many believe they add contemporary beauty to the diverse landscape of London, this is overshadowed by the privilege and prestige they represent. While this is a rising issue among the community, the question still remains if future developments will be built for the benefit of the many rather than for the benefit of the few.
Where do I see architecture in London going? Well, I hope it's going to move away from where it currently is, where it's driven by capitalism and making money, towards being focused on the need to address the inequalities of a city like London and to make places where people can afford to live and that are really well designed and that have a high construction quality that creates, a long-term piece of city or long-term pieces of city that are enjoyed by ordinary Londoners.
For most of history, human societies and cultures have been linked with the physical structures they interact with day to day. The physical architecture of London is unique because here, necessary structures have been greatly celebrated for their aesthetic appeal, more so than their practicality. In Roman times, the material a person's house was built from determined their status. In a similar way, today, the wealthy and powerful commission these steel and glass skyscrapers, while ordinary citizens are left in brick and concrete. Whether such structures take the form of looming corporate offices, uniform public housing, or elaborate cathedrals from the medieval ages, architecture continues to be a prominent facet of the Londoner's daily life. In a city where the architectural history of centuries apart stands side by side, the deep visual and cultural contrasts of London are unavoidable. Architecture, first and foremost, will always adapt to the needs of the people who inhabit it. And in London, it is more clear than anywhere else in the world that this is a city where the needs, wants, and culture of the people have ebbed and flowed immensely over centuries.
When Londoners try to sort of bring down to size some of these great buildings and these great institutions, they are asserting themselves over against the buildings. It's the way I understand it. And also, they are grasping at that thing we all long for, that this is our town. And I am a participant in it. Though actually, London doesn't notice when you die. London is very forgetful of ordinary people. And so when we can say, oh, there, we're kind of playing with the idea that this is my hometown. And I think that comes from the fact that we all long for home.